Everything that some of you might, I should say, I handed everything back to you folks that was pending, so nothing to hand back today. I hope you got the email. I did reiterate Wednesday's exam. I did reiterate various due dates and things of that nature. So we'll get on with things. Some of this should be review, some of this should be, what shall I say, continuation of a discussion of Hume's empirical criterion of meaning. Recall the empirical criterion of meaning makes what claim? That all meaningful ideas, that is, ideas that have any kind of actual content, meaningful content, are traceable to what? Yeah. Yeah. They must, in principle, be traceable back to sensory experience. Now, there are many metaphysical issues, and you want to remember that. It is a challenge, not just epistemically, but he will challenge basically all metaphysical utterances. It will provide grounds for challenging all metaphysical claims. Now, some of what I'm going to talk about here we've already discussed, and I also have these as bullet points in my notes for those of you who chose to check those out. Remember, David Hume challenges that we can have a meaningful conception of God. And this is on the grounds that the believer says that God is infinite perfection. However, we can have no meaningful idea of perfection. And as an extension of that, we can have no meaningful conception of God. This is why Hume would say, because we can't even really comprehend the idea, there are no grounds for believing in it. Now, Hume would admit that there is no way that we could disprove the idea either, but that ought to be cold comfort to the believer. Does anyone know why? Hume would have to admit that we cannot disprove the concept of God. But that should be only cold comfort to the believer. Now, this is not mentioned in the text. But keep in mind, he would say, A, you can have no clear concept of God anyway. So you don't even truly understand what you think you believe. Number two, if you make a claim about something's existence or non-existence, who has the burden of proof?
You do.
Yeah, the person who makes the claim. So if you're going to claim there is a perfect being that we call God, you are the one who has the burden of proof to come up with the evidence. And by the way, the believer's faith would not pass as a logical argument for David Hume. You can have no clear idea of God. Thus, you can have no clear idea over whether God exists or not. There is no good reason for believing, according to Hume. We already discussed the problem of religious histories and testimony. And I had that discussion along with Hume's critique of miracles. Recall that testimony by its very nature is suspect. What is testimony? What is testimony, folks? If I testify to something, what am I doing? Yeah, I saw Smith. He was in class today. Now, you'll notice that is if you knew who Smith was and you knew that Smith was a regular attender of class, you would probably trust my testimony. Why? because my testimony would be consistent with your experience. And if you know that the person who's giving the testimony is generally what? Yeah, is generally trustworthy, that would be a reason to trust that person's testimony. However, if an otherwise trustworthy person gives testimony that flies well in the face of your experience, the fact that it flies against your experience ought to give you reason to doubt the otherwise trustworthy person. Now, what's the problem with most religious histories?
We can't confirm who wrote it.
Yeah, we can't even confirm who wrote them. And if you don't know for sure who wrote them, you don't know whether or not the testimony therein is reliable or unreliable. Now, if the testimony being given is so extraordinary and goes so far out of your realm of experience, that should be a double reason for doubting it. And he talks about this in his bit of miracles. He says, if you heard a story, and this is reiteration, if you heard the story of a man who was walking with a peg leg, I'm admittedly, taking a little license, but it is the gist of his story, of the story he gives. And you heard of this cardinal who gave him this special salve and prayed over him, and he rubbed the special salve on his leg, and you heard that he had grown his leg back, and that there were people who testified to the fact that now they see him with a leg. You should doubt those claims before you what? Yeah, before you believe them or before you trust them, because the claims are just so extraordinary as to be unbelievable. This is why, let's say a time in the distant future. Suppose I got all of you to write down and type in your cell phones, Instructor Gaynor grew wings and started flying around the classroom. I wouldn't care how many notebooks I saw that in. I wouldn't what?
Believe it.
I wouldn't believe it. Because as far as I know, human beings do not sprout wings and fly around classrooms. I've never experienced it, and I wouldn't care how many learned men had allegedly written it down. I would doubt it before I trust it. Even if I viewed it with my own eyes, I would wonder if I was what? Yeah, confused, hallucinating, etc., etc. In other words, if something so extraordinary as that happened, I should doubt my senses before I believed it. If it flies so far afield of my normal everyday experience. This is why when people make miraculous claims, I mean, granted, back in the 70s when people were really into supernatural bullcrap, we haven't changed that much, by the way. You would hear stories of a person who was in a difficult situation. You've heard of scenarios of superhuman strength. They'd say, yes, we were in an auto accident, and my son was pinned under the car. I know I don't weigh very much and I'm not strong, but somehow I lifted up that car. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you don't need to call on miracles or guardian angels in order to explain how something like that might happen. Because if you know anything about adrenaline, perhaps you've had your own personal experience when you did something that you did not believe you were capable of doing. I once outran someone who I saw was way faster than me. I won't say who I was running from. But it was first week freshman year of college when I was involved in a little bit of stupidity. And I'm not recommending, I have no idea how I outran this guy. I mean, he was the fastest guy on the commie kickball team, soccer team. Fastest guy on the team, I outran him. I was a little bit scared of Unipol, university police. Now that might explain it, but I ran as fast as I ever ran in my life. I didn't think myself capable, but guess what? People are sometimes capable of things that seem to be, supernatural or even impossible. But guess what? It wasn't like I was going 50 miles an hour. Now, if you told me a human being ran 50 miles an hour, I don't care who that person is, I wouldn't believe it. And that's because we learn in anatomy and physiology that human bodies are not built to be able to run that fast. We don't have the mechanics for it. So even if somebody said, yes, I witnessed so-and-so running 50 miles an hour, and I was the one keeping the stopwatch, I would say, dude, you're full of it. Because I know that's not what? It's not physically possible. If something would seem to break the laws of nature, then you should doubt the testimony before you think the laws of nature were broken. This is why when people make any kind of wild and crazy claims, did I mention my aunt last time? She believes that she can astrally project herself. I'm saying, well, I don't believe in that. I think it's interesting when it's in science fiction shows and things of that nature, but I have no reason to believe, A, that I have an astral body, let alone that I can project my astral body. Now, if you make claims that you have projected your astral body somewhere, I would like you to be able to tell me what your astral body did when it was on this traveling. I mean, isn't this... You only see this in like horror movies like Insidious, right? Or when the kid's gone to the upside. No, that wasn't an astral body, right? Yeah, but yeah, my aunt believes she's got an astral body. Now, of course, I don't sound very nice when I'm making fun of this. But I'm playing David Hume here. He would say, if a person is not made some kind of statement that can be reasonably verified, then you should doubt it before you believe it. You should doubt it before you believe it. Now, I noted last time, with amusement, I should say cynical amusement, that the very same people who hold that the miraculous testimony that happens in their own religion's sacred text are super gung-ho about how true it is. Yet they would say what about another religion's alleged miracles? They would scoff at them and say how ridiculous it is. Is there anything more ridiculous about the idea of a statue of Ganesh, having milk come out of it? Is there anything more ridiculous? I mean, if that is a ridiculous thing, then so is the idea of a person doing what? Walking on water or turning water into wine. As far as I know, those things don't what? Don't happen. Now, of course, David Hume knew that such statements wouldn't make people too happy. Also wouldn't make them very comfortable. Because when you talk about a person's metaphysical beliefs and you challenge them, people are liable to get a little bit upset. Because people glom onto their metaphysical beliefs, perhaps because of this. And by the way, the text does not give Hume enough credit here. What we're willing to believe might not tell us about what's believable. It might really just bespeak to our psychological tendencies to believe things that we have psychological reasons for believing. And this is, I'm sure, where we about left off. What does David Hume say about the self and personal identity? Unlike Descartes and John Locke, he rejects the psychological continuity model of the self. For what the author of our text calls David Hume's what? For David Hume's bundle theory. When we say his bundle theory, what are we talking about a bundle of? We're talking about the self as a bundle of perceptions. This thing I call myself is only a bundle of perceptions. Because everything I know about this thing that I call myself was gathered through what? Through my sensory experiences. Now, I might like to believe myself to be more than just this bundle of sensory perceptions. And to go a little bit John Locke on you, the philosopher John Locke would argue, you are not just your body. And did I talk about this one I mentioned last time that if I were to come into the classroom today without an arm, you wouldn't say that I was a different person. Because we tend to associate a person's personhood with their character, their psychological makeup, and so on and so forth. You would likely only think of me as a different self if I had a Psych 101 Phineas Gage type experience. How many of you remember reading about Phineas Gage in a psych text at one point? He is the fellow who ended up getting the famous rod through his frontal lobe. And as a result, his personality radically altered temporarily. He was referred to for a while as no longer Phineas. He was referred to for a while as no longer Phineas because he no longer what? He looked like Phineas, he had Phineas's body, but he no longer behaved like Phineas. In other words, in cases like this, we would start to question if he was in fact the same person. Now folks, none of you are like Phineas Gage, I imagine. However, David Hume would say that we are all like Phineas Gage, only by what? But only by degree. Because the fact is, some of the things that I take to be most stable about me, our best neurophysiology tells me are not stable at all. I'm talking about this. We oftentimes tie our selfhood in with our memory. But of course, what is the problem with memory? My memories are constantly what? They're constantly changing. And unlike the time of John Locke, during his time, they believed that our memories were something like a copy of the experiences that we had. But what do we know now about our memory? Our mind is active in interacting with our experiences. Our memories are not literal recordings of events as they happened. Not only are our memories not accurate to how things happened, but our memories do what over time anyway? Yeah, they change over time. When I'm trying to recollect something that happened to me 20 years ago, I might have what I believe to be the most vivid images in my mind of those events. But I can tell you that I know this. Those images my mental images are not accurate to what actually happened. They are not. Our best science today tells me that they are not accurate. I can't even accurately remember last week, let alone 20 years in the future. Now, David Hume isn't saying that we don't have this thing that we call a self. What he is saying is that there is no continuous thing as common sense tells us of a self. That this thing that we call the self is a continuously changing bundle of percepts and changing memories. You are never the same self. And the text doesn't talk about this. But he uses a fabulous, well-known argument to try to illustrate. It's well known. It's called the case of Theseus' ship. Who was Theseus? He was a Greek hero. They made some bad movies about Theseus, in recent years. But yeah, according to this story, it tells of the many voyages taken by Theseus' ship. And in the course of those voyages, his ship has needed plenty of what? It's needed plenty of repairs. So much so that there is not one shred of the current Theseus ship that was part of the ship when it was first built. So the question is it the same ship? The question is it the same ship? Guess what? This question cannot be answered. Because on one hand, it does seem to be what? Yeah, it does seem to be the same ship because it's got the same structure. It still belongs to Theseus and he still goes on journeys with this particular ship. But in a literal sense, it is no longer the same ship. Because every single part is different. Well, take a guess who is exactly like Theseus' ship. Yeah. Our so-called selves are no different from Theseus' ship. Because our best biology tells us that the only thing truly stable about you is this thing that we call your genetic code. Because there is not one shred of your flesh and blood person that's part of you now that was part of you 10 years ago. Not one shred of you, because our cells what? Yeah, our cells die off and regenerate. So even though I have memories of my past, even though I have the same driver's license as I did 3 years ago, I have the same driver's license number as I did, 30 years ago. I have the same driver's license, Pennsylvania driver's license number as I did 30 years ago. Aside from some grays, I still vaguely have the same hair color. But of course, there's not one head on my head that's what? Yeah, that's the same as my hair in the original 16-year-old driver's license. So in a very real sense, I am not identical with my quote-unquote past selves. I'm not even identical with myself from 30 seconds ago, or a second ago, or a quarter. You get the idea here? There is this thing that we call the self might merely be a convenient shorthand for this constantly changing thing. Now notice the only reason why you think of yourself as a stable thing is because you don't notice what? Yeah, we kind of conveniently ignore all the changes. We conveniently ignore all the changes. Now you're probably not going to say, I don't have a self. And that's because psychologically we need to believe in the concept of, I erased it, we psychologically need to believe in the concept of selfhood. But there's still more. Because we have no meaningful concept of a self, I should say stable, unchanging concept of the self, he is also skeptical of this.